Hey, it's Jeannie Yandel in for Patricia Murphy. It's Wednesday, and this is Seattle Now. We've been waiting for a COVID vaccine all year. It's the only way our lives might go back to some semblance of normal. Now, vaccines are almost here, but don't go running to the closest pharmacy just yet. We won't all be vaccinated for a while. Crosscut reporter Hannah Weinberger will tell us more in a minute. But first, let's get you caught up. COVID really has its hands in everything, including how many new laws will get passed. Washington State House Majority Democrats will be limited to a maximum of 7 bill proposals each next year. Democrats in the state legislature will prioritize 4 key areas for the 2021 session: racial equity, COVID response, economic recovery, and climate change. The legislature will also combine remote and in-person lawmaking. Many of the first coronavirus vaccines are set to arrive on ice at SeaTac Airport. The vaccines are being shipped from Michigan in special high-powered freezer containers. The ultra freezers will keep Pfizer's doses at 94 degrees Fahrenheit below zero and Moderna's vaccines at 30 degrees. The doses have to be kept icy cold. If they warm up, enzymes can degrade the vaccines. And Canada is closing its border to the U.S. indefinitely. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said the current U.S. travel ban would only be lifted once COVID is under control globally. 3/4 of Canada's exports go to the U.S., so essential trade, including agriculture and pharmaceuticals, will continue. Even by 2020 standards, we're in a pretty dark time. Shutdowns are back, and more people are dying from COVID than at almost any other point during the pandemic. But there may be a light at the end of the tunnel. The first COVID vaccine could be approved by the FDA as soon as next week, and more vaccines are on their way. Hannah Weinberger is here to explain Washington's plan for rolling out the vaccines and what we still don't know about them. She's a science reporter at Crosscut. Hi, Hannah. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, socially distanced.
Yes, very socially distanced. We're in 2 different buildings entirely. So the FDA might give emergency approval to Pfizer's COVID vaccine next week. What does the timeline look like for people here in Washington state to start getting vaccinated?
Right. So there are some really rapidly approaching dates being thrown out there right now, both from state government and federal government leaders. Moncef Slaoui, who's leading the National Vaccination Development and Distribution Program known as Operation Warp Speed.
Wow.
I know, right? What a name. Announced right before Thanksgiving that the operation is prepared to start shipping vaccines to immunization sites within a day of approval by the FDA. That means we could start seeing vaccines reaching Washington in mid-December.
Wow. I mean, I'm hearing 2 things from what you're saying. One, mid-December, that's 2 weeks from now.
It is.
But also, there are a lot of ifs and a lot of conditions in what you just told us. And we want to unpack a lot of that. But first, we know that Washington State has a plan for who gets priority access to vaccines. It's important to point out that we don't all get vaccinated in like mid or late December here. So what does that priority access plan look like?
So right now, the state is working from a 4-phase plan. The first phase, which will be seeing vaccines first in December, if that happens, is the super high risk phase. So these are people who cannot avoid active COVID infections. People like health workers, first responders, people with really, really serious underlying health conditions. And potentially, it'll also include older adults in congregate or long-term care facilities. The second phase, once we meet the needs of everyone in that first phase, which might take a while, are people with essential jobs. So people who are out and about because of their work, they can't avoid other members of society very easily. People who have underlying conditions that are a little less serious are also considered in that group. People in homeless shelters or prisons or other areas where they're in congregate settings or they don't have as great access to medical care. And then all older adults who aren't included in that first phase are also going to be included. So that phase is for when we still have relatively limited amounts of vaccine, but enough to start ramping up. We have a lot more hospitals and other healthcare providers who are able to deliver large numbers of these vaccines. Phase 3 happens when we have a lot of vaccine available. And that's when we humans who have fewer underlying health conditions and are able to socially distance, quarantine more easily, work from home, are probably going to start thinking about their ability to get vaccinated.
I know that I am not in that high priority group. You're probably not in that high priority group. So how long might we need to wait before we get vaccinated?
Well, the draft plan was estimating Washington State would get about 2% of the very first vaccine doses available, maybe 200,000 by the end of December. And the state estimates it needs to vaccinate between 150,000 and 400,000 people in the first 2 months in that high priority group alone. There are also 3 million people with comorbidities alone, so it might take a while to get out of that first phase, which doesn't necessarily preclude people in later phases from getting the vaccine. I'm sure that this is not going to be a hard and fast thing. It's going to be pretty scrappy. So we could be waiting for a while.
So we can't talk about vaccines without talking about vaccine skepticism. There was a Gallup poll in October that said about 40% of people didn't know if they would get a COVID vaccine immediately. You know, and some of those people are, in general, skeptical of vaccines. Other people are worried about whether these COVID vaccines are effective, whether they've been vetted and tested thoroughly enough, given the speed with which they've been released. So how is Washington State trying to address those concerns?
You know, there's a lot of rational, understandable mistrust of the medical system. In general, from certain high-risk communities, Latinx and Black communities have been most heavily impacted by the virus. But systemic racism in the medical system means they are not only underserved, but exploited. So giving those communities agency and leadership in this process is so important. And in reviewing Washington State's draft plan, there is a lot of emphasis on outreach, education, and conversation. So there's listening sessions, surveys, where people who are going to be vaccinated have an opportunity to weigh in on this draft plan and say, this is concerning to me, or are you sure you considered equity in this aspect of the process? And as long as that's something that actually gets factored into how this plan develops, I would feel positive about it. But I think it's important to continually monitor that.
Let's just assume that at some point, most of us get vaccinated. Is this a silver bullet? Does this mean that the pandemic is over?
You would wish for that. But
I am wishing for that.
There's a lot that we don't know about the long-term success of these vaccines, which it doesn't mean that they don't work, that we don't have this long-term data yet. It's just still, a black hole. We don't have that information yet. So what that means is we don't know how long immunity lasts, whether you're going to have to get these 2-dose vaccinations yearly, semi-regularly, etc., whether this is a lifelong commitment for each person. And we don't know whether vaccination stops the immunizee from being a vector of disease. What that means is I could be vaccinated, be exposed to the virus, and still transmit it to someone else. And we're going to have to see what immunizing millions of people means for that.
Hannah, what will you be watching over the next few weeks and months to gauge how this rollout is going?
Maybe I'm the only one, but I'm fascinated with the supply chain logistics of this. We need so much dry ice to keep all of these vaccines from going bad. We need super cold storage for some of these vaccines. The infrastructure necessary to hit all of these marks is going to be astronomical. And I'm also curious to see how people's relationships with these vaccines develop and how their relationships with each other develop based on those decisions. So what'll it mean for me if I decide to get the vaccine and someone I care about doesn't? What'll it mean if I have the vaccine and all of a sudden there's this dystopian storyline that develops where I'm able to do things that other people aren't? I don't think that's likely, given that the first people to get the vaccines are not people who are going to be like, time for vacation. Like, these are people who are in hospitals actively trying to keep people from dying. Like, it's not licensed to just live as we used to, that normal that people keep talking about that's never going to happen.
so many questions still. Hannah Weinberger is Crosscut science reporter. Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you for having me on.
If you want to read more about the plan for distributing vaccines in Washington, check out Hannah's story about it. There's a link in the show notes. Seattle Now is produced by Clare McGrane, Matt Martin, Sophie Reed, Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, and Jason Pagano. Matt Jorgensen does our music. Patricia Murphy is back tomorrow. So until next time, I'm Jeannie Yandel.